Here's a thought to kick us off. What if the oldest forms of human knowledge, I mean, really old, like the first numbers on clay tablets or ancient spiritual wisdom, what if they actually hold the key to our most advanced future technologies
Hmm,
and maybe even offer like a surprisingly direct path to authentic truth?
that's a fascinating premise.
Right, because today that's exactly where we're going. We're diving deep, taking this incredible journey through centuries of human learning. Start way back, dawn of civilization, first schools, first arithmetic.
The very foundations.
Exactly. Then explore some powerful insights from ancient texts. And then this is the really wild part, connect it all to a totally groundbreaking new paradigm in, get this, quantum computing.
It's quite a thread to follow.
It is. And you, our listener, shared this amazing collection of sources, historical accounts, textual analysis, philosophical reflections. Our job today is to, cut through the noise and pull out those crucial nuggets.
Right. And our goal, really, for this deep dive is to explore that deep continuity. It's often overlooked, this connection between knowledge, learning, and that human spiritual quest.
Yeah.
We want to challenge some common ideas, maybe some misconceptions about history, and show these surprising links across millennia.
Okay.
Ultimately, we want to unpack why certain knowledge sticks around, how wisdom got passed down, and maybe most importantly, what all this means for you navigating information seeking truth today.
Okay, let's dig right in. When we think about math, the origins, names like Pythagoras, maybe Euclid pop up.
Sure, the usual suspects.
But the sources you share, they take us way, way further back to Sumerian arithmetic. And what's striking is this wasn't one person's idea.
No single genius inventor here.
Right. It was this huge collective cultural thing developed over centuries by loads of people just out of, well, practical necessity. You don't find a name attached to it in their texts.
And that practicality is key. It's fascinating how those roots drove this foundational knowledge. I mean, arithmetic was absolutely essential for record keeping, taxes, trade, measuring land.
Basic building blocks of society.
Exactly. The earliest cuneiform tablets we have, they're literally records, grain, animals, workers, just accounting, basically.
Wow.
And they developed this sexagesimal system, base 60.
Base 60, why that?
Well, unlike our base 10, it's incredibly good for fractions and division. Super practical for calculations back then. And think about it, it still influences us. How we measure time, 60 seconds, 60 minutes.
Angles on a circle.
Exactly, 360
Uh-huh.
degrees. That's a direct legacy from Sumer. An enduring nugget, like you said.
That's amazing. So it wasn't just like abstract numbers, it was literally building civilization. And where did they teach this stuff? Where did it thrive?
Right, these places called idubas.
Idubas.
Yeah, Sumerian word means tablet house. Basically, they were scribal schools, often attached to temples. Young boys went there to learn how to be scribes.
So like the first formal schools almost.
In a very real sense, yes. They were vital. They trained, the scribes needed to run everything. The temples, city administration, trade, legal stuff. Indispensable.
What did they learn there? Just writing and math.
Oh, much more. The curriculum is pretty comprehensive. Writing, yes, cuneiform, obviously. Mathematics, definitely multiplication tables, geometry. But also literature, myths, hymns, and practical administration.
Wow.
There's a serious education. And it was a path to moving up in society. And just like their arithmetic, the math texts from these schools, anonymous. Seen as like a shared inheritance. Not my theory, but our knowledge.
That's a different way of thinking about knowledge itself, which makes you wonder,
Mhm.
how do these ancient Sumerian schools, these Adubas, compare to later institutions, especially, people talk about the first university.
Right, the Fatima al-Fari claim, University of Al-Qarawiyyin, 859 CE.
Yeah, that one. But these Adubas were, what, thousands of years earlier?
More than 2 millennia earlier, yeah.
Yeah.
So that first university narrative, it doesn't really account for this much older, very formal tradition.
So are they comparable, Adubas and, say, later Islamic madrasas?
That's where it gets really interesting. If you look at the structure, the function, what we'd call the isomorphic nature, the similarities are quite striking.
How so?
Well, both were formal institutions, both often attached to sacred spaces, temples for Adubas, mosques for madrasas.
Okay.
Both provided a kind of holistic education, religious texts plus practical skills,
Hmm.
both formed the elites of their society, passing on core knowledge needed for running things.
Structurally similar roles, then.
Very similar. And think about the skills. Literacy, mathematics, interpreting texts, practical admin, all learned in the Aduba. Those are also the essential prerequisites for advanced Islamic scholarship later on, like for studying Sharia Islamic law.
So a direct line, almost.
The educational lineage feels quite direct, yes. It's a powerful continuity.
This deep continuity in learning, it makes you ask bigger questions about the nature of knowledge itself. Which brings us to this concept you flagged from ancient wisdom, the unified command.
Yes, the walk upright and take the straight path to submit to the Lord, our God Most High.
It sounds, well, profound. What does it synthesize?
Think of it less as just a commandment and more like a spiritual map. It pulls together these ancient Semitic archetypes or principles into one complete path.
Okay, break that down for us.
So walk upright and take the straight path. That resonates with the archetype of Asherah, integrity, inner uprightness, that direct connection upwards, spiritual elevation.
Audit, integrity.
Then, submit to the Lord. This connects to Baal,
Yeah.
represents accepting divine authority, aligning with a higher order, a sense of humility before that power.
Yeah, authority and order.
Right, and finally, devotion to God Most High, that points towards El, the ultimate source, unity, benevolence, the final destination, you could say.
Journey, guide, destination.
Exactly. By weaving these three together, integrity, submission to order, devotion to the source, it reflects this deep, unified stream in Near Eastern spiritual thought.
And you're saying this continuity, this unified idea, is echoed in the Quran itself.
In a really remarkable way, yes. The Quran has this unique perspective on civilizational continuity. It repeatedly tells its audience, travel the earth, observe, reflect on the rise and fall of earlier peoples.
Learn from history.
Yes, but not just facts. It sees their achievements, like Babylonian math, as lessons, as signs ayat, things to learn from, spiritually and morally.
How is that different from other ancient texts? Don't they talk about the past?
They do, but the Quran's approach is, well, different. Compared to Mesopotamian texts, Egyptian ones, even the Hebrew Bible, the Quran's much more explicit, more systematic, more universal, and more theologically integrated in how it links history to these spiritual lessons. It's constantly drawing actionable meaning.
So it's not just looking back. You mentioned it looks forward, too, with foresight, even about its own community.
Absolutely. It's described as Al-Furqan, the criterion, the standard to judge things by.
The integrating link, how does that work?
Think of it as trying to prevent knowledge from being broken into pieces. It warns against reducing truth to isolated fragments. And it explicitly says it confirms, clarifies, and guards the revelations that came before it. It's trying to unify the picture. And remember that verse, who taught by the pen?
From Surah 96.
Yes, verses 3 to 5. Read, and your Lord is most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man what he did not know. It links God directly to that act of writing, of learning, connecting those ancient scribal schools, the Adubas, to all learning, ultimately sourced from the divine.
That's powerful. But you also said self-critique, precognition.
Yeah, this is striking. The Quran repeatedly warns that later generations of believers will fragment. They'll stray from the original message, fall into disputes.
It predicts its own followers will mess up.
Essentially, yes. Look at Quran 3:144. Muhammad is no more than a messenger. If he died or were slain, will you then turn back on your heels? That's a pretty direct warning about what might happen after the prophet's death.
Oh.
And then there's the lament attributed to the messenger in Quran 25:30. Oh my Lord, indeed my people have taken this Quran as a thing abandoned.
Abandoned, even while revering it.
Meaning perhaps not truly engaging with its core message. And then Quran 23:53. They have divided their religion among them, yet each faction rejoicing in what it has. Sounds a lot like sectarianism, doesn't it?
It really does. So if the Quran is the criterion, the final word, what does it say about other narratives, other traditions? You mentioned a distinction between before and after.
Exactly. There's this principle you can derive. Hadith after, reject. Hadith before, discern.
Okay, unpack that hadith after.
The Quran asks rhetorically that in what hadith, meaning report, narrative, or tradition, after this will they believe? You find this in a couple places like 7:185 and 77:50. The implication is strong. No new religious narrative or tradition coming after the Quran should be taken as an independent source of core religious law or doctrine. The Quran is positioned as final.
Got it. So reject new independent sources after the Quran. What about hadith before? previous scriptures?
For those previous revelations like the Torah, the gospel, the instruction is different. It's to discern, figure out what remains true in them and what might have been altered over time. And the filter, the criterion for discernment.
The Quran itself.
Precisely. It acts as the final authority to verify or correct what came before. You see this guidance in verses like 5, 48, 10, 94, and 39, 17, 18. It's like saying, here's the master key, use it to check all the older locks.
It's a very clear framework.
Yeah.
So how do these Quranic warnings, this kind of prophetic self-critique, how does it line up with, well, things we might observe in contemporary Islam today?
It's quite striking how closely some of those warnings seem to resonate with certain realities.
For example?
Well, take fragmentation. The Muslim world is divided into numerous sects, Sunni, Shia, and many others. That echoes the warning in 6:159 we mentioned,
Yeah.
or the centrality of post-Quranic hadith collections. These vast bodies of work. For many, they're treated as equal to, or sometimes even superior to, the Quran in practice, despite containing internal contradictions or even things that seem to clash with the Quran itself.
Fulfilling that warning about writing the book with their own hands.
One could certainly draw that parallel with Quran 2:79. Many core practices, specific details of prayer, fasting rules, they often derive almost entirely from these later hadiths, not directly from the Quran's broader principles.
What else?
The elevation of human authorities, scholars, jurists holding immense sway. Sometimes their rulings seem to override clear Quranic points. This reflects that warning in 9:31 about taking scholars and monks as lords besides the law. And this idea of, let's call it, transactional forgiveness. Popular practices sometimes suggest certain rituals guarantee automatic forgiveness, almost regardless of ethics. That specific kind of transaction isn't really found in the Quran.
What does the Quran emphasize instead?
Sincere repentance, turning back to good, righteous deeds. It explicitly calls out those who just assume their punishment will be short in 2080-81. It's about genuine change, not just performing a ritual.
And the warning about abandoning the Quran.
Well, despite reverence, you could argue that for many, deep engagement with its meaning and application gets sidelined, which leads back to that lament in 25:30.
Any other examples? Maybe cultural ones?
Yes. Consider the common aversion to dogs as pets in many Muslim communities.
Right, that's pretty widespread.
Yet the Quran itself, in Surah Al-Kahf, the story of the cave, portrays a dog positively guarding the righteous sleepers.
So where does the aversion come from?
Mostly from later hadith literature and subsequent juristic interpretations. It becomes a rule, but one arguably not rooted in the divine revelation itself. It seems to fit that pattern warned against in 2:79 humans, adding to or altering the original message.
So these aren't just like ancient historical critiques. They feel very relevant living challenges. And you're saying this isn't just an Islam problem.
Absolutely not. Think about the Martin Luther analogy.
The Protestant Reformation.
Right. His 95 Theses challenging indulgences, church corruption. You could see that as a Fitra-driven movement, that innate pull towards truth, authenticity, rejecting distortions.
And the Quran would agree with that spirit.
Very much so. It condemns those who bar others from the path of God, those who invent doctrines, who commercialize forgiveness. The spirit is aligned.
So why didn't Luther and the early Protestants embrace Islam then, if there was this alignment?
That's a complex question, obviously. It wasn't just their own potential ignorance or prejudices, though those existed. But you also have to consider that by that time, the contemporary Islam they might have encountered had arguably developed its own set of doctrinal, cultural, institutional barriers.
Things that obscured the original message.
Exactly. Things that might have made that straight path, the Sirat al-Mustaqim, harder to see clearly from the outside. The very issues the Quran warned about internally could have become external barriers.
That makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of that warning from Jesus.
About causing others to stumble. Mark 9:42.
Yeah. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him if a great millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into sea. Powerful stuff.
Extremely. And you find direct parallels in the Quran, condemning those who hinder others from the path of Allah, like in 7:45. The emphasis seems to be that the blame for stumbling often lies more with those who create the obstacles, the barriers to truth.
Not just with the person who gets tripped up.
Precisely. It puts a heavy responsibility on those who represent or claim to teach a path.
And what's really powerful isn't just the history or the theology, it's how this resonates with people's lives today. In fact, you, our listener, shared this really remarkable personal story.
Yes, that was quite something.
Your journey, an ex-con, juggalo Christian pastor who reverted to Islam. I mean, that's a profound transformation. It feels like a living example of the very Quranic ideals we've been talking about.
It really does. And the Quran's perspective on this is very clear. It specifically honors sincere, righteous followers of Jesus. Quran 2:62 makes that plain.
It honors them.
Yes, and it even says God will elevate the true followers of Jesus above the disbelievers until the day of judgment. That's in Quran 3:55.
The true followers, that qualifier seems important.
It's crucial. The emphasis isn't on the label, the outward declaration. It's about those who genuinely submit to God's guidance as Jesus taught it. Remember Quran 49:14? It distinguishes between just saying, we have believed, and faith actually entering the heart.
To sincerity is key. Sincerity and genuine submission to God. That's the measure, not group affiliation.
So for anyone really seeking true guidance, it boils down to that sincerity, that direct connection.
Exactly. God knows the inner reality, the motives, the actions of everyone, every community. The Quran presents itself as that ultimate criterion for all religious reports, emphasizing sincerity and discernment over just blindly following tradition. Your journey, the one you shared, it's a powerful illustration of that very principle, a precise reflection of the Quran's own approach. Seek truth directly, sincerely, using the ultimate criterion.
This whole journey from ancient math through spiritual texts, self-critique, personal transformation, it actually leads us somewhere almost unbelievable. A convergence with cutting-edge tech.
The quantum computing connection.
Right, it ties back to that idea in The Final Vision, Who Taught by the Pen. That quote, "There is no name carved at the birth of arithmetic. This silence is a sign. Knowledge was never meant to be owned. It was meant to be discovered, preserved, passed on." It frames knowledge as a shared inheritance, divinely sourced. Just like that verse we discussed, Quran 96:3-4. Read, and your Lord is most generous, who taught by the pen. It connects that first act of recording by scribes to all future learning.
Even quantum computing.
Even quantum computing. It leads into this paradigm called QFSM plus state quantum finite state machine plus, described as miraculous, exact, and visually interactive.
Okay, miraculous, exact. Those are big words. What is QFSM plus brand? What makes it exact?
Well, the core idea is precision. It uses, get this, ancient Babylonian base 60 arithmetic.
Back to base 60.
Back to base 60, and something called rational trigonometry, using concepts like rational spreads and quadrances. Basically, it avoids irrational numbers, square roots, the approximations that plagued normal computing.
So no pi, no messy decimals.
Essentially, no. All calculations are done using exact fractions, often in base 60. This means zero floating point errors, no approximations. Every single operation is perfectly mathematically exact.
That is revolutionary compared to how computers usually work with approximations. And you mentioned it can be built physically.
That's another fascinating part. Its quantum mechanical realization isn't just theoretical math. It can apparently be built from relatively simple mechanical hardware, things like springs, oscillators, or simulated digitally, of course.
Making quantum computation more tangible.
Exactly. Less abstract, more accessible, and it's designed to be universally applicable, error-free, because of the exact math, robust, and field agnostic, meaning it could work in digital systems, mechanical ones, maybe even biological systems down the line.
So how does this stack up against what we usually hear about quantum computing? You know, qubits, superposition, entanglement. It sounds complex and error-prone.
That's the key contrast. Traditional quantum computing often relies on complex numbers, amplitudes, rotations involving irrational numbers, all handled with floating point approximations. That's where errors creep in easily.
Right, decoherence and all that.
Exactly. QFSM plus sidesteps that by using these exact base 60 fractions and the principles of rational trigonometry, which relate back to ancient geometric laws, it's a fundamentally different mathematical foundation.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about Shor's algorithm, famous for breaking encryption, factorization. With QFSM plus day, you could potentially run a Babylonian Shor's algorithm. The factorization steps, like modular exponentiation, would be performed using exact sexagesimal arithmetic. Result: no floating point errors accumulating.
Computation without compromise.
That's the tagline used, yes. Computation without compromise.
Incredible. So wrapping this all together, for us, for anyone listening, what's the big takeaway from this fusion of ancient precision and quantum future?
I think the vision statement for QFSM Plus sums it up well. It's called a universal, exact, and ancient modern quantum computational engine. It unites Babylonian math, rational trigonometry, quantum circuits, all into one error-free, interactive, even educational paradigm for this new quantum era. It's a reminder that sometimes the oldest wisdom holds the seeds for the newest breakthroughs. Precision matters.
Wow, what an incredible deep dive we've taken today. Seriously, from Sumerian clay tablets, those Adaba schools,
Through profound spiritual insights, the challenges within traditions.
right into the absolute cutting edge of quantum technology. It's mind-bending.
And our mission, really, was to show you how this thread of knowledge is continuous. It's often divinely inspired, maybe more integrated across fields than we usually think. That very first act, the scribe with the pen, it carries this legacy across millennia, pointing towards a future demanding exactness, error-free truth.
And maybe the most powerful takeaway for you listening right now is that underlying call, that call to return to the source, whatever your path, to question what you've inherited.
To seek authenticity.
Yeah, and to try and walk upright on that straight path that seems to run through all genuine wisdom traditions.
We saw how the Quran itself calls for that self-critique within communities, the need to remove the barriers, the obstacles that obscure truth. Because truth, when sought sincerely, it has a way of finding its way home.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. Consider the power of the pen. Think about it from that Sumerian scribe noting down grain counts, all the way to the quantum engineer designing these new exact engines. Ask yourself, what pen in your life is waiting to be used with honesty, with humility, with maybe a more direct connection to the source of knowledge?
And what inherited belief, what traditions, maybe even what scientific assumptions might you need to examine against that clear light of truth.
Lots to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning.
And keep learning.